Well, tempers frayed in Parliament in Canberra yesterday, just as social cohesion has, over how to recognise the October 7 terror attacks. Joining us live now is our Wednesday panel, Labor MP Julian Hill, Liberal MP Keith Wolahan. Keith, we'll start with you. What was your biggest issue with yesterday?
I think the biggest issue was it was a day to acknowledge the tragedy that happened a year ago, and it was missed, and it should have been a uniting moment, but it wasn't. I've got here the press release that the Prime Minister did on the 20th anniversary when he was opposition leader of September 11. And in it, he acknowledges the tragedy of that day 20 years on. Now, we are a nation that fought in the subsequent wars. I personally fought in those wars, and we acknowledge the mistakes that were made, the civilian casualties that occurred in those wars. But this press release doesn't say anything about that, because you can, on a day, on an anniversary, acknowledge the grief that happened. And that's what the Prime Minister did then, but he didn't yesterday. And that's a one-year anniversary, significant anniversary. So The question is, why is the Prime Minister holding Israel to a standard that we don't hold to ourselves? And I think the answer to that question will be very instructive, and I think the Australian people deserve to know. OK,
and that's a good argument. Julian, what's your response to that, bearing in mind that this was Israel's 9/11?
Well, I agree with some of the words Keith used. There should have been a moment of national unity, but with the greatest of respect, because we do get on, and I do respect Keith, some of what he said was simply not true. October the 7th, the anniversary, was a sombre moment and represents the largest loss of Jewish life since World War II, and the anniversary was a difficult time for many Australians. The motion that the Prime Minister came into the Parliament and moved, which I would have hoped quite genuinely every Member of Parliament could have supported, it recognised the significance of October the 7th. It condemned anti-Semitism in all its forms and called that out. It recognised the loss of civilian life that has ensued in Israel, in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, and it called for the cycles of violence to stop. I'm absolutely confident that the position that the government put forward in good faith, in respectful tones, is one that Australians would support. And if we're going to pull out pieces of paper, I just want to put the words on the record. These are the words that were so objectionable that Peter Dutton couldn't bring himself to rise above partisan division, that the Parliament stresses the need to break the cycle of violence and support international efforts to de-escalate for a ceasefire, that we call for Iran to cease its destabilising actions, including through terrorist organisations, something which Peter Dutton talks about every single day, that we affirm our support for a two-state solution as the only option for a just and enduring peace. That is Australia's position. And the point that Keith made, which I do have to contradict, the motion did exactly what Keith just called for. It reiterates unequivocal condemnation of Hamas's terror attacks on Israel. It recognises that hundreds more innocent people were subjected to brutality and violence on that day. It called for the release of the remaining hostages. It did everything which the opposition called for. But unfortunately, Peter Dutton, a 20-year career of race baiting and division, the nastiest, most negative opposition leader in Australian history, could not bring himself to a moment of national unity. He's unfit to be Prime Minister.
The point of contention, though, it was broadened. Keith, your response to that?
I think that was beneath Julian to pull out that card, to tear down the character of Peter Dutton. And I hope we'll get to the
Peter
character
Dutton
of the Prime Minister.
tears down his own character day after day.
Well, I think we'll talk about the Prime Minister's character very shortly, including how he conducted himself in the Parliament yesterday, how he has conducted himself on several occasions in the Parliament. It's not just a spur of the moment where he loses his cool. This is the Labor business model. They don't want to engage in ideas. They don't want to engage in values. They seek to tear down the leader of the Liberal Party, whoever it is. Whoever it is, you go back through the last few decades, whoever the leader of the Liberal Party is, they paint them as this cartoon villain, and that's what we just heard then. This was a moment where we should have acknowledged the great tragedy that happened 1 year ago.
And that's exactly what we did.
That's
exactly what the motion does.
I just read on the anniversary of September 11th.
You can't deny the words that were in the motion.
He didn't mention war crimes. He didn't mention civilian casualties. That doesn't mean we don't acknowledge those, but we do those on another day. On the day, the 1 year anniversary, that's the day you acknowledge the tragedy that happened that day.
I'm absolutely confident that Australians want the cycles of violence to stop.
Julian, Jewish leaders have asked for both major parties to preference each other above the Greens. Will Labor do it?
Well, as you know, and I think this was addressed in the Parliament yesterday, it's been addressed, it comes up periodically. Political parties call on each other around preferences. Political parties decide preferences, not you, not me, not Keith. That's how it works. But The hypocrisy, I'll just make the simple point. The hypocrisy of Peter Dutton and the Queensland LNP supporting that call or making that call, asking that question, when the only reason there are Greens in the Queensland State Parliament is because the Liberal Party preferenced them, is a little bit beyond the pale. But
sounds like you're not going to do it.
Sort out preferences, as you know.
Sounds like you don't want to do that.
I just said to you, political party.
What's your preference?
You can draw whatever conclusion you like. Political parties sort out preferences. Peter Dutton's party preferenced the Greens in Queensland, which is why they're in the Parliament.
Okay. Just on Keith's point, do you think the Prime Minister was out of line by using that Tourette's slur against Angus Taylor yesterday?
Oh, look, the Prime Minister's words were insensitive and he immediately withdrew and apologised. I was actually in the chamber later last night when he came in and again provided a more extensive apology, acknowledged that the words were insensitive. I think if we're honest, Pete, you, me, Keith, your listeners, everyone at times says things that they regret that they shouldn't have said. The mark of character to me is not the confected outrage that sometimes may ensue in the political theatre. It's exactly what we teach our children and we try to do ourselves, which is to apologise, to recognise when you've been insensitive, and that's exactly what happened. I was there in the chamber on both occasions.
Okay. Julian, Keith, appreciate your time as always. We'll talk to you again soon.